The morning sun broke through the clouds as Richard Miller stepped off the tour bus, his camera already hanging around his neck. At 57, this trip to London marked his first time outside the United States, and he had spent months planning every detail. Back home in the small town of Millfield, where he'd lived his entire life, Richard had shown everyone his itinerary: Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Big Ben, all the famous landmarks he'd only ever seen in movies and TV shows. "All right, folks, stay together now," called out Penny, their tour guide, a cheerful woman with bright red hair and an even brighter yellow raincoat. "We've got exactly 45 minutes at Buckingham Palace before we need to head to our next stop." Richard hung back from the group, taking in the grandeur of the palace gates. The ornate gold and black metalwork gleamed despite the typical London drizzle that had just stopped. Everything felt different here. The air, the buildings, even the way people walked seemed to have a sense of history behind it. "First time in London?" asked an elderly woman standing next to him, her accent clearly American like his own. "That obvious, huh?" Richard laughed, adjusting his baseball cap with the logo of his hometown football team. "We all have that same look of wonder," she smiled. "I'm Helen from Chicago, Richard from Millfield. Small town you probably never heard of." As they chatted, Richard felt his phone vibrate. His daughter had texted, "Did you see the guards yet?" "Take lots of pictures." He smiled, thinking about how he had promised his grandkids stories about the famous guards who never smile or move. Growing up in Millfield hadn't prepared Richard for much of what he was experiencing now. The town had stayed roughly the same size for decades, just under 5,000 people, most of whom worked at the factory on the edge of town or commuted to the city 40 miles away. Richard had retired last year after 35 years at that same factory, and this trip was his retirement gift to himself. The tour group moved closer to the palace, following Penny's raised umbrella like ducklings after their mother. Richard felt a flutter of excitement as they approached the area where the royal guard stood at attention. Their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats looked even more impressive in person than on television. "These guards are members of the Queen's Guard, one of the oldest and most elite military units in the British Army," Penny explained to the group. "Many of these soldiers have served in combat zones around the world before receiving the honor of this ceremonial duty." Richard pushed forward slightly, eager to get a better view. That's when he noticed one of the guards standing perfectly still at his post. Lieutenant Michael Thompson stood rigid, eyes forward, not a muscle moving in his face. His dark skin contrasted with the bright red uniform, and Richard found himself staring longer than he should have. In Millfield, Richard rarely encountered people who didn't look like him. The town had remained largely unchanged in its makeup for generations, and while he wouldn't consider himself prejudiced, there was an uncomfortable feeling of unfamiliarity that he couldn't quite shake. "They say these guys train for months just to stand still like that," whispered a younger man in the tour group, snapping photos rapidly on his phone. "Imagine having that kind of discipline." Lieutenant Thompson had indeed trained rigorously for his position. At 32, he had already completed 3 tours of duty, earned multiple commendations for bravery, and was respected throughout his regiment. His grandfather had immigrated to Britain in the 1960s, and both his father and uncle had served in the British military before him. For Thompson, wearing the uniform represented not just personal achievement but a family legacy of service. As tourists gathered around, taking photos and sometimes making silly faces trying to get the guards to react, Thompson remained perfectly composed. He had learned to look through people rather than at them during his duty, maintaining the stoic demeanor expected of the Queen's Guard. Richard found himself hanging back slightly from the rest of his group. Something about the scene made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was seeing someone so different from himself in such a traditional British role, a role that, in his mind, he had always pictured filled by people who looked more like the guards he'd seen in movies. Amazing, isn't it? Helen had appeared beside him again. "My son-in-law is in the military back home. He says these guards go through more rigorous training than most people realize. That uniform weighs a ton, and they stand out here for hours without moving." Richard nodded, trying to focus on the conversation rather than his discomfort. "Must take real dedication," he managed. The group moved around the perimeter of the guarded area, and Richard found himself drawn to observe Lieutenant Thompson more closely. The guard's perfect stillness was mesmerizing in a way. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his face despite the tourists waving and posing beside him. They're not allowed to move, speak, or react to anything unless there's a security threat, Penny explained to the group. It's considered disrespectful to touch them or try to interfere with their duty. As if on cue, a young boy from another tour group darted forward and tried to mimic the guard's stance beside him. The boy's mother quickly pulled him back, apologizing profusely, though Lieutenant Thompson gave no indication he'd even noticed. Richard felt his phone buzz again. Another text from his daughter. "Did you get a picture standing next to one of the guards?" He looked up at Thompson and felt a strange reluctance. Back in Millfield, he sometimes made comments at the local diner about how things were changing and people taking jobs that didn't seem right for them. Nothing he considered hateful, just observations about the world shifting away from what he knew growing up. But standing here now, those thoughts felt smaller somehow, pettier than they had seemed over coffee with his friends. He watched as Lieutenant Thompson continued his duty with perfect professionalism, despite the circus of tourists around him. "Want me to take your picture with the guard?" Helen offered, noticing Richard's hesitation. Maybe later," Richard said, stepping back slightly. "Let's see the changing of the guard first." As the crowd shifted, Richard found himself standing closer to Lieutenant Thompson than before. Up close, he could see the details of the man's uniform, the perfectly aligned buttons, the immaculate red fabric, the metal ribbons indicating service that Richard couldn't identify but understood represented sacrifice and courage. A memory surfaced from years ago. Richard's nephew had joined the army after high school and had come home changed, more serious, more worldly. "Uncle Rich," he had said during a family barbecue. "My squad leader was this guy from Detroit. Black guy. Saved our whole unit during an ambush. Never met anyone braver." Richard had nodded politely then, but standing here now, the memory carried more weight. He looked at Lieutenant Thompson and wondered about his story. Where he came from, what battles he might have fought in, what led him to stand here in this ceremonial role representing centuries of tradition. The tour group started to move on toward the next viewing area, but Richard lingered a moment longer. He raised his camera slowly and took a respectful photo from a proper distance, not as a curiosity or novelty, but as recognition of someone performing their duty with honor. "Come along," Richard called Helen. "Penny says we're going to catch the beginning of the changing of the guard if we hurry." As Richard turned to follow, he caught himself reflexively nodding toward Lieutenant Thompson, a small gesture of respect he hadn't planned. The guard's expression remained unchanged, of course, but for a brief moment, Richard felt something shift in his own perspective. He hurried to catch up with the group, tucking his camera away. The rest of London awaited, full of experiences that would challenge what he thought he knew about the world. For the first time since arriving, Richard felt truly open to what those challenges might teach him. Behind him, Lieutenant Michael Thompson remained at his post, standing guard as he had done hundreds of times before, representing a tradition that was both unchanging and ever-evolving, much like the country he served. The afternoon sun beat down on the crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace. The earlier drizzle had given way to unexpected warmth, causing Richard to remove his light jacket and tie it around his waist. His tour group had returned to the palace after lunch to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, something Penny had assured them was absolutely unmissable. "Folks, we're in luck today," Penny announced, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "We've got perfect timing for the ceremony. Find a good spot and remember to stay behind the barriers." Richard pushed his way forward, determined to get a better view this time. The morning's brief encounter with Lieutenant Thompson had left him with mixed feelings he couldn't quite sort out. As he maneuvered through the crowd, he noticed the same guard was still at his post, standing perfectly still despite the growing heat. "Can you believe they have to wear those heavy uniforms in this weather?" a woman next to Richard commented, fanning herself with a tourist map. "Must be boiling in there," Richard agreed, squinting against the sun to get a better look. The crowd had grown significantly since the morning. Tourists from all over the world jostled for position, cameras and phones held high to capture the famous ceremony. Richard found himself wedged between a large family speaking German and a group of college-age students taking selfies. "Excuse me," he muttered, trying to find a better vantage point. No one moved. Frustration began to build as he realized he might miss the ceremony, despite having returned specifically to see it. He'd come all this way, spent all this money, and now couldn't even see properly. After several unsuccessful attempts to find a better spot, Richard noticed a small opening near the barrier, close to where Lieutenant Thompson stood guard. He quickly made his way there, relieved to finally have an unobstructed view. From this position, he could see the guard's face clearly, stoic, unmoving, eyes focused straight ahead. The ceremony began with the approach of the new guards. The crowd fell silent as the rhythmic sound of marching feet grew louder. Richard raised his camera, ready to capture the moment, when someone bumped into him from behind, nearly causing him to drop his expensive camera. "Hey, watch it," Richard snapped, turning to see a teenager who had been pushed forward by the surging crowd. "Sorry, man," the kid mumbled, backing away. The small incident had caused Richard to miss the first part of the ceremony, and his frustration grew. He turned back around, determined to enjoy what was left, when he realized he had been pushed even closer to the barrier. Now he stood mere feet from Lieutenant Thompson. The heat, the crowd, the missed photo opportunity, it all began to wear on Richard's patience. Back home in Millfield, he was used to space, to being respected as one of the town's longtime residents. Here he was just another tourist, anonymous and unimportant in the crowd. "They probably pick them for how still they can stand, huh?" said a man who had squeezed in beside Richard. His accent marked him as American too, possibly from the South. "Like statues, these guys." Richard nodded, glad for the momentary connection with a fellow American. "Been watching that one all morning," he said, gesturing subtly toward Lieutenant Thompson. "Not even a twitch." "Yeah," the man replied, lowering his voice. "Surprised they got him wearing the uniform, though. Doesn't seem to fit, if you know what I mean." The comment hung in the air between them. In that moment, Richard had a choice: to acknowledge the man's implied prejudice or to ignore it. Back home, he might have nodded along, maybe even added his own comment. It was the easy thing to do, the expected thing in certain circles. But something had shifted during his time watching the guard. Lieutenant Thompson had stood there for hours, representing centuries of tradition with dignity and discipline. The guard's unwavering commitment to his duty demanded respect. "Regardless of anything else, actually," Richard said slowly, "I think that uniform fits him just fine." The man gave him a strange look and moved away, finding another spot in the crowd. The ceremony continued, with precision marches and the rhythmic stamp of boots on pavement. Richard watched, genuinely impressed by the display of discipline and tradition. When it ended, many tourists began to disperse, heading to their next destination. But Richard lingered. He wanted one good photo before leaving, something to show his grandkids back home. As the crowd thinned slightly, he raised his camera again, focusing on Lieutenant Thompson. That's when he noticed a commotion several yards away. A man in a bright Hawaiian shirt was getting increasingly loud, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Come on, just one smile. What's wrong with you people?" he shouted at another guard. Palace security was already moving toward him, but the man continued, his voice slurred slightly, suggesting he'd had a few drinks with lunch. "My tax dollars probably pay for these guys anyway." "Actually, sir, unless you're a British taxpayer, they don't," a security officer said firmly, approaching the man. Richard watched the scene unfold with embarrassment. The loud tourist was clearly American, and Richard could feel people looking at him too, as if all Americans were cut from the same cloth. The security officer was calmly asking the man to step back behind the barrier when things escalated. The drunk tourist shoved past the officer and approached the guard he'd been taunting. "I just want a reaction. What are you robots?" He waved his hand in front of the guard's face. More security personnel were moving in now, but not quickly enough. The tourist turned, scanning the line of guards, and his eyes landed on Lieutenant Thompson. Richard felt a chill despite the warm day. Something in the tourist's expression changed when he saw Thompson, a narrowing of the eyes, a twist of the mouth. The man began walking directly toward Thompson's post. "Hey you," the tourist called out, his voice carrying an ugly edge now. "Yeah, you. How'd they let you in here? Don't you know this is for the Queen's Guard?" People in the crowd began to murmur uncomfortably. Some started recording with their phones. Richard felt rooted to the spot, watching in horror as the scene unfolded. The tourist was now standing directly in front of Lieutenant Thompson, far too close and clearly beyond the barriers. Security was approaching from behind, but not fast enough. "This is what's wrong with everything these days," the tourist continued loudly, his face reddening. They'll let anyone wear the uniform, won't they? Even... What came next was a slur so offensive that several people in the crowd gasped. Richard flinched at the word, a term he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. Lieutenant Thompson remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, his eyes focused straight ahead as he had been trained to do. His discipline was remarkable given the provocation. The tourist, emboldened by Thompson's lack of reaction and still not apprehended by security, stepped even closer. "What's wrong? Can't hear me? Or maybe you just don't belong here and you know it." Richard found his voice at last.
"Hey, back off!"
he shouted, surprising himself. "Leave him alone." The tourist glanced at Richard with contempt. "Mind your own business, old man." Security was only steps away now, but the tourist made one final, terrible choice. Fueled by alcohol and hatred, he reached out and shoved Lieutenant Thompson's shoulder hard. "I'm talking to you," he snarled. What happened next occurred so quickly that many in the crowd later had trouble describing the exact sequence of events. Lieutenant Thompson, trained in both ceremonial duty and actual combat, reacted with precision and control. Without breaking his proper posture, his right arm came up in a defensive block that deflected the tourist's hand. In the same fluid motion, Thompson shifted his weight, causing the aggressive tourist to stumble forward off balance. The tourist flailed, trying to regain his footing, and in doing so, twisted his ankle and fell ungracefully to the ground. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Before he could recover, security personnel were there, quickly restraining him. "You saw that. He attacked me," the tourist shouted, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "He can't do that." The security officer looked down at him coldly. "Actually, sir, members of the Queen's Guard are authorized to protect themselves when physically assaulted. You crossed the barrier and initiated physical contact. I'm afraid you'll be coming with us now." As they led the protesting tourist away, Lieutenant Thompson resumed his perfect stance, his expression revealing nothing of what had just transpired. To look at him now, one would never know he had just defended himself against assault. Richard stood there, camera forgotten in his hands, processing what he had witnessed. Around him, the crowd was buzzing with conversation, many still recording on their phones. He knew this incident would likely be all over social media within the hour. What struck Richard most was the control Thompson had shown. The minimum force necessary, applied with perfect discipline. There had been no rage, no retaliation beyond what was required to defend himself. Even in that heated moment, the lieutenant had upheld the dignity of his position. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard took one last look at Lieutenant Thompson standing at his post. Without thinking, he raised his hand in a small salute of respect, a gesture that felt right in the moment, though the guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, giving no sign that he had noticed. Richard turned away, heading back to find his tour group, his thoughts troubled but clarified by what he had witnessed. Sometimes respect was earned in unexpected moments, and sometimes a person's true character was revealed not by what they said, but by how they conducted themselves when tested. Behind him, Lieutenant Michael Thompson continued his duty, standing guard for Queen and country, his dignity intact despite the ugly encounter, perhaps even enhanced by it in the eyes of all who had witnessed his restraint and professionalism in the face of hatred. The police station bustled with activity as Richard sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting area. He hadn't expected to spend his afternoon here, but when the officers had asked for witnesses to give statements about the incident at the palace, he'd felt compelled to come forward. "Mr. Miller?" A young police constable appeared in the doorway. "We're ready for you now." Richard followed the officer down a narrow hallway into a small room with a table and 3 chairs. The walls were bare except for a clock and a framed photo of the Queen. Another officer, older with graying hair at his temples, sat at the table reviewing some papers. "Have a seat, please," the older officer said, looking up. "I'm Detective Inspector Wilson. Thank you for coming in voluntarily. It shouldn't take long." Richard settled into the chair, feeling strangely nervous despite having done nothing wrong. "Happy to help," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Could you walk us through what you witnessed today at Buckingham Palace?" Inspector Wilson asked, pen poised over his notepad. Richard took a deep breath and recounted the events as clearly as he could remember them. The drunk tourist's approach, the horrible slur, the shove, and Lieutenant Thompson's controlled response. As he spoke, he realized how angry he still felt about the incident. "And you say you heard the accused use racial slurs directed at the guardsman?" the inspector asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, clear as day," Richard confirmed. "I couldn't believe my ears." "In public, in front of children and everything?" The inspector nodded, making notes. "And in your view, did Lieutenant Thompson use excessive force in his response?" Richard shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. The guy shoved him hard, right in the chest. The lieutenant I don't know, it was like a defensive move. He barely touched him, really. The tourist tripped over his own feet more than anything." After a few more questions, Richard was asked to read over his statement and sign it. As he did so, the younger constable returned to the room. "Sir, the footage from the tourist's phone has been sent over," he said to Inspector Wilson. "And we've received 3 more videos from bystanders that show the entire incident." "Good," the inspector replied. "That should clear things up quickly." He turned back to Richard. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. Your tour guide gave us your hotel information in case we need to reach you again, but I doubt that will be necessary." As Richard stood to leave, curiosity got the better of him. What's going to happen to him? The tourist, I mean. Inspector Wilson's professional demeanor softened slightly. "The Crown takes assaults on the Queen's Guard very seriously, Mr. Miller. Add to that the racial element, which makes it a hate crime under our laws. He'll face charges, quite serious ones." Richard nodded, feeling a surprising sense of relief. In Millfield, he'd sometimes heard people make offensive comments without consequences. The inspector's words gave him a strange comfort, that here at least such behavior wasn't tolerated. "What about Lieutenant Thompson?" Richard asked. "He'll continue his duties. There'll be a standard review, but based on witness statements and video evidence, he acted entirely within protocol." The inspector closed his notebook. "The Queen's Guard are soldiers first and foremost, Mr. Miller. They're trained to protect themselves and others when necessary." Richard left the police station and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. His tour group had continued without him, with Penny promising to meet him back at the hotel later. For now, he had a few hours to himself in London. He wandered the streets near the station, his mind replaying the day's events. Growing up in Millfield, Richard had rarely questioned the casual prejudices that floated through everyday conversations. Jokes at the diner, comments at church picnics, assumptions made about people they'd never met. It had all seemed harmless enough at the time. But seeing hatred directed so blatantly at Lieutenant Thompson, a man doing his duty with dignity and discipline, had shaken something loose in Richard. The ugliness of it was undeniable when witnessed up close. Lost in thought, Richard found himself outside a small pub. The sign read "The King's Arms," and something about its weathered wooden exterior seemed inviting. He pushed open the door and stepped into the dim interior, welcoming the smell of beer and the buzz of conversation. He took a seat at the bar and ordered a pint, still sorting through his thoughts when he noticed the television in the corner. The bartender was turning up the volume as a news report came on. "Breaking news from Buckingham Palace today," the reporter announced. "A tourist has been arrested after assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard in what witnesses describe as a racially motivated attack." Richard's stomach tightened as shaky cell phone footage appeared on screen. From this angle, he could see himself in the background, his mouth open in shock as the events unfolded. The guard, identified as Lieutenant Michael Thompson, defended himself according to military protocol. The tourist, whose name has not been released, is currently in custody. The footage cut to a statement from a palace official, confirming that Lieutenant Thompson had acted appropriately and would face no disciplinary action. "That's becoming all too common, isn't it?" said a voice beside Richard. He turned to see an older man with a weathered face sliding onto the next bar stool. "Tourists thinking our guards are just there for show." "It was awful," Richard replied, surprising himself by adding, "I was there. I saw the whole thing." The man's eyebrows shot up. "Were you now?" "What happened exactly?" "The news isn't showing everything." Richard found himself recounting the incident again, his anger resurfacing as he described the tourist's behavior. The man listened attentively, shaking his head in disgust. "Disgraceful," the man said when Richard finished. "Lieutenant Thompson showed remarkable restraint, if you ask me." "You know him?" Richard asked, surprised by the familiar way the man had said the guard's name. The man took a sip of his beer. "Not personally, no. But my nephew serves in the same regiment." Says Thompson is one of their best. 2 tours in Afghanistan decorated for bravery. Earned his place in the Guard through merit, not politics like some suggest. Richard nodded slowly, taking this in. He'd assumed the ceremonial positions were just that. Ceremonial. Learning that Thompson was a combat veteran added another layer to his understanding. In my day, the man continued, the Guards were all white lads from certain backgrounds. Times change, and thank goodness for that. Britain's different now, more diverse, but the standards haven't dropped an inch. Higher, if anything. Their conversation drifted to other topics. The man's 40 years working for the London Underground. Richard's first impressions of England. The surprising quality of British beer that Americans rarely acknowledged. It was the kind of easy conversation between strangers that Richard enjoyed but seldom experienced back home, where everyone knew everyone else's business. As evening approached, Richard glanced at his watch and realized he needed to head back to meet his tour group. Thanks for the company, he said, settling his bill. Glad to provide it, the man replied. And if you see Lieutenant Thompson again before you leave London, give him a proper salute from an old soldier, will you? Richard smiled. I will. Outside, London had transformed in the fading light. Street lamps glowed warmly, and the city had taken on a different energy as day shifted to evening. Richard walked slowly, in no hurry to return to his hotel and the inevitable questions from his tour group. He thought about calling his daughter to tell her about his day, but decided against it. How could he explain what had happened and, more importantly, how it had affected him? It wasn't just witnessing the incident, but realizing how easily he could have been like that tourist. Perhaps not as blatant or violent, but harboring the same prejudices, just better hidden. As he waited at a crosswalk, Richard noticed a newspaper stand with the evening edition already displaying headlines about the Palace incident. One paper had a photo of Lieutenant Thompson in his full ceremonial uniform, standing at attention, the very image of British tradition and discipline. Richard bought a copy, folding it carefully to take home. Not as a souvenir of an ugly incident, but as a reminder of something important he'd learned about respect and dignity, about judging people by their actions rather than appearances. Back at the hotel, he found Penny in the lobby, clearly relieved to see him. Richard, there you are. We were worried when you didn't meet us at the Tower of London. The others said you went with the police? Had to give a statement, he explained simply. I was close enough to see everything happen. Penny lowered her voice. They're saying on the news it was racially motivated. Is that true? Richard met her eyes directly. Yes, and it was one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. Something in his tone must have communicated his feelings clearly, because Penny simply nodded and didn't press for more details. Instead, she handed him the itinerary for the next day. We're visiting Westminster Abbey in the morning. The bus leaves at 8 sharp. Richard took the paper, thinking about Lieutenant Thompson, who would be back at his post tomorrow, continuing to do his duty with the same discipline and dignity, despite what had happened. I'll be there, Richard said. Wouldn't miss it. That night, as he lay in his hotel bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of London outside his window, Richard found himself wondering what Lieutenant Thompson was thinking now, and hoping that someday he might have the opportunity to tell him just how much respect he had earned that day, not just for defending himself with such control, but for continuing to stand tall in the face of hatred. 3 days had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace. Richard sat in the hotel lobby, suitcase packed beside him, waiting for the airport shuttle. His tour of London was coming to an end, but the events he'd witnessed kept replaying in his mind. The night before, he'd called his daughter, Carol, trying to explain what had happened and how it had affected him. Dad, it's all over the internet, she had told him. Someone posted the video and it's gone viral. They're even talking about it on the morning shows here. Richard had been surprised. They're showing it back home? Everywhere, Dad. The tourist was from Georgia, apparently. They've released his name, Patrick Donovan. He's got a history of this kind of behavior. The name had meant nothing to Richard, but knowing the man was American had made him feel a strange sense of collective shame. How's the Guard doing? He'd asked. Lieutenant Thompson. The articles say he's received commendations for how he handled it. There's even a hashtag trending. Respect Thompson. Now, as Richard waited for the shuttle, he scrolled through his phone, reading the latest updates about the incident. The tourist, Donovan, had been formally charged with assault and committing a hate crime. He was facing significant fines and possibly jail time. His lawyer had released a statement claiming Donovan had been overserved at lunch and deeply regretted his actions. Regrets getting caught, more like, Richard muttered to himself. "Excuse me?" An older woman looked up from her book in the chair across from him. "Sorry, just talking to myself," Richard replied, embarrassed. The woman smiled. "About that awful business at the palace? I noticed your accent. Are you American too?" Richard nodded reluctantly, feeling that strange collective guilt again. "Don't worry," she said, seeming to read his thoughts. "Most of us know that one man doesn't represent all Americans." "Thank you for that," Richard said. "I was actually there when it happened. Gave a statement to the police and everything." The woman's eyes widened with interest. "Really? What was it like?" "The videos online only show part of it." Richard found himself describing the scene again, still troubled by what he had witnessed but also proud of how Lieutenant Thompson had responded. As he finished his story, he checked his watch. "My shuttle should be here soon. I need to check something at the front desk before I go," he said, standing up. At the desk, he asked the receptionist a question that had been on his mind for days. "I'm wondering if it's possible to send a letter to one of the Queen's guards. Lieutenant Michael Thompson, specifically." The receptionist looked surprised. "That's an unusual request, sir. The palace doesn't generally pass personal correspondence to the guards." "I understand," Richard said, disappointed but not surprised. "I was there when that tourist confronted him. Just wanted to express my respect for how he handled himself." The receptionist's expression softened. "Let me make a call." She stepped away and spoke quietly into the phone while Richard waited. After a brief conversation, she returned with a smile. Given the circumstances, they said a letter could be forwarded through official channels. "If you'd like to write something, I can ensure it's delivered properly." Grateful, Richard sat in the hotel's business center and carefully composed his letter. He wasn't a man who found words easy, especially when it came to expressing feelings, but this felt important. He wrote about his admiration for Thompson's dignity and restraint, and how witnessing the incident had made him reconsider some of his own attitudes. After sealing the envelope, he handed it to the receptionist just as the shuttle driver announced its arrival. As the bus pulled away from the hotel, Richard took one last look at London, feeling he was leaving with much more than photographs and souvenirs. Patrick Donovan sat in his solicitor's office in London, looking miserable in his rumpled suit. At 46, the Georgia businessman had never expected to find himself in this position. Passport confiscated, facing criminal charges in a foreign country, and becoming an international symbol of American racism. The Crown Prosecution Service is not inclined to be lenient. "Mr. Donovan," his solicitor, Mr. Ainsworth, explained, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. Multiple videos, dozens of witness statements, all consistent, and Lieutenant Thompson's statement is particularly damning." Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "Can't we just, I don't know, pay a fine and be done with it? I've got a business to run back home." Mr. Ainsworth's expression remained professionally neutral, but his voice cooled. "This isn't a parking violation, Mr. Donovan. You're charged with assault and a hate crime. The court takes both very seriously." "It was just words," Donovan muttered, though without much conviction. "Words matter here, Mr. Donovan. And you didn't stop at words, did you? You laid hands on a member of the Queen's Guard. That alone would be enough to face charges." Donovan stared at the floor. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. His company had already issued a statement distancing themselves from him. His wife had called in tears, telling him their children were being harassed at school. His face was on websites and newspapers around the world. "What do I do?" he asked, his bluster finally gone. "If I may be frank," the solicitor said, "your best option is to plead guilty, show genuine remorse, and hope the court shows mercy. Fighting these charges will only prolong the process and likely result in a harsher sentence." Donovan nodded slowly, the full consequences of his actions finally dawning on him. "And if I do that, what am I looking at? A substantial fine at minimum, possibly a suspended sentence, and you'll have a criminal record." Mr. Ainsworth gathered his papers. "I suggest you use this time to reflect on what led you here. Mr. Donovan, the court will want to see that you understand the gravity of your actions." Left alone in the office, Donovan put his head in his hands. One moment of drunken hatred had destroyed the life he'd built. And for what? Lieutenant Michael Thompson stood in his apartment, adjusting his tie in the mirror. His dress uniform hung ready for tomorrow's special ceremony at the palace. After the incident, he had expected to continue his duties quietly, as was his way. Instead, he had been informed that the Queen wished to recognize his exemplary conduct and restraint in the face of provocation. His phone buzzed with another message from his mother. The family WhatsApp group had been busy ever since the video went viral. His younger sisters sent screenshots of support hashtags. His father shared links to news articles praising Thompson's professionalism, and his mother alternated between pride and worry. "Call me when you get a chance," her latest message read. "Your grandfather wants to speak to you too." Thompson smiled. His grandfather, who had served in the British Army in the 1960s, had been the first to encourage him to pursue a military career. "They may not always make it easy for people who look like us," he had told a teenage Thompson. "But that doesn't mean we don't belong." Those words had stayed with him through basic training, through 2 combat tours, and through the rigorous selection process for the Queen's Guard, and they had been in his mind as he stood motionless while Donovan hurled slurs and then physically attacked him. Thompson picked up a stack of letters that had been forwarded to him through official channels. Messages of support from around the world. Most were from people he'd never meet, expressing admiration for his composure and dignity. One, from an American named Richard Miller, stood out. It wasn't just a message of support, but a thoughtful reflection on how witnessing the incident had changed the writer's perspective. "I come from a small town where we don't always examine our assumptions about people," Miller had written. "Seeing how you conducted yourself with such dignity made me realize I've been carrying attitudes that don't hold up when tested. I want to thank you for that lesson." Thompson set the letter aside, touched by the honesty. He had received official commendations before, but somehow this simple acknowledgement from a tourist who had happened to be there meant something different. His phone rang, his mother calling rather than waiting for him to call her. "Michael, have you seen the news? They're saying the man who attacked you is going to plead guilty." "That's good," Thompson replied quietly. "Makes things simpler. Your cousin in America says it's all over their news too. People are talking about what it means, about racism, about dignity, about standing up for yourself the right way." Thompson hadn't wanted to become a symbol or start a conversation. He had simply done his duty and protected himself as he'd been trained to do. But he understood that sometimes events took on meanings beyond the individuals involved. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" his mother asked. "The ceremony? I'll be fine, Mum. It's just another duty." "It's not just another duty, Michael, and you know it. The Queen herself asked for you to be recognized. Your grandfather is beside himself with pride." After finishing the call, Thompson returned to the window of his apartment, looking out at the London evening. Tomorrow he would stand at attention while his commanding officer read a commendation. He would accept it with the same discipline and restraint he brought to all his duties. But tonight, alone in his apartment, he allowed himself a moment to feel the weight of what had happened, not just the ugly confrontation, but the aftermath, the worldwide attention, the messages of support, the recognition from the palace. And most surprisingly, letters like Richard Miller's suggesting that something good might come from an ugly moment. Thompson had never sought to be more than an excellent soldier doing his duty. But if his response to hatred had sparked reflection in even one person like Richard Miller, perhaps that was its own kind of victory, quieter but more lasting than any confrontation could be. 6 months had passed since Richard Miller had witnessed the incident at Buckingham Palace. Back in Millfield, life had largely returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning coffee at Dale's Diner, Wednesday night bowling league, Sunday services at First Methodist. But something had changed in Richard, subtle yet significant, like a small stone that alters the course of a stream. It was Tuesday morning, and Richard sat in his usual booth at the diner. Newspapers spread before him as he worked on his second cup of coffee. Dale himself slid into the seat across from him, wiping his hands on his apron. "Busy morning," Dale commented. "Tour buses stopped on their way to the state fair." Richard nodded, looking up from his paper. "Heard them pulling in. A lot of out-of-towners today." Dale glanced at the newspaper. "Anything interesting?" "Just the usual." Richard hesitated, then carefully folded the paper to reveal a smaller article near the bottom of the page. "Though I did see this." Dale squinted through his reading glasses. "British soldier receives medal for service. That's the guy from the video, isn't it? The one that tourists tried to mess with?" Richard nodded. Lieutenant Thompson. Looks like he's been promoted to captain now. 6 months ago, Richard might have kept scrolling past such an article. Now he'd specifically looked for it after hearing a brief mention on the morning news. He'd followed the story from afar. The tourist's guilty plea, the fine and suspended sentence, the official commendation ceremony for Thompson. There had even been a brief international debate about how the Queen's Guard should respond to harassment, ultimately resulting in no policy changes. Their right to defend themselves had been affirmed. Whatever happened to that tourist? The guy who started it all? Dale asked. Lost his job. Had to do community service. Last I heard, he was working with some organization that fights racism, part of his rehabilitation. Richard shook his head. Amazing how one stupid moment can change your whole life. Dale raised an eyebrow. You still think about that day a lot, don't you? More than I expected to, Richard admitted. It was just seeing hatred up close like that. It's different from hearing about it on the news. The bell above the diner door jingled as a group of tourists entered, looking around uncertainly for seating. Dale stood up. Duty calls. Your breakfast is on the house today, old friend. No need for that, Richard protested. Dale smiled. Call it a reward for being our town's international ambassador. Not every day someone from Millfield makes it into the world news. As Dale walked away, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. Dad, check your email. Something from England came for you. Curious, Richard pulled up his email on his phone. Carol had forwarded him something, adding, This arrived at our house addressed to you. I scanned it right away. Richard tapped the attachment and his coffee nearly spilled as his hand jerked in surprise. The letterhead read, Office of the Royal Household, and below it was a brief, formal note addressed to him by name. Dear Mr. Miller, it began, your correspondence to Captain Michael Thompson was forwarded to this office at his request. Captain Thompson wished to express his gratitude for your supportive words and thoughtful reflection. Enclosed, please find his personal response, which he asked to be delivered to you. Below the official note was a second page, a handwritten letter from Thompson himself. Mr. Miller, it read. Your letter reached me during a time when I was receiving much attention, both welcome and unwelcome. Among the many messages, yours stood out for its honesty and self-reflection. It is one thing to condemn obvious hatred. It is another to examine one's own assumptions and be willing to change. That takes real courage. You mentioned your grandchildren in your letter. If they learn from your example, to remain open to new perspectives even later in life, then they will be well equipped for the diverse world they're growing up in. You also asked if I was all right after the incident. I am well, thank you. In my years of service, I have faced far worse than one angry tourist. What matters is not what comes at us in life, but how we choose to respond. With respect and gratitude, Captain Michael Thompson. Richard read the letter twice more, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't expected a response, especially not a personal one. Thompson could have ignored his letter among the thousands he must have received. Instead, he had taken the time to write back, to acknowledge the connection that had formed in that strange moment outside the palace. Later that day, Richard sat on his front porch, watching his grandchildren play in the yard. 7-year-old Tyler and 5-year-old Lily were chasing each other around the oak tree, their laughter carrying across the lawn. Carol had dropped them off for their weekly visit, which had become the highlight of Richard's week since his retirement. Grandpa, Lily called out, running up the porch steps. Tyler says the guards in England aren't allowed to smile ever. Is that true? Richard smiled. Well, they're supposed to stay very serious while they're on duty. It's part of their job. But they can smile when they're not working, right? Her face was so concerned that Richard had to chuckle. Of course they can. They're regular people just like us when they're not in uniform. Tyler joined them on the porch, always interested in anything military. Grandpa, did you really see one of those guards fight a bad guy? Richard paused, considering how to explain what he'd witnessed in terms the children could understand. I saw a guard protect himself when someone was very rude and pushed him. He didn't really fight, he just made sure he didn't get hurt. Was he a good guy? Tyler asked, with a child's straightforward sense of justice. Yes, Richard said firmly. He was a very good man doing his job with honor. Even though the bad man was mean to him because of his skin? Tyler asked innocently. Richard looked at his grandson in surprise. They hadn't discussed that aspect of the incident around the children. Where did you hear about that part? Tyler shrugged. I heard Mom talking on the phone about it. She said you stood up for him. Richard felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment. I tried to, though I wish I'd done more. Sometimes it's hard to know what to do in the moment. My friend Anthony at school has brown skin, Lily offered. Jason said Anthony couldn't play astronauts with us because astronauts don't look like him. And I told him that was stupid because my teacher showed us a real astronaut who looks just like Anthony. Richard felt a swell of pride. That was very good of you, Lily. You stood up for your friend. Mrs. Henderson said we should always stand up for people when others aren't being fair, she added matter-of-factly. Out of the mouths of babes, Richard thought. His grandchildren were growing up in a different world than he had, learning lessons in kindergarten that he was still struggling to fully absorb in his 60s. I got something special in the mail today, Richard said, pulling out his phone to show them the scanned letter. From that guard in London. He's a captain now. The children were suitably impressed that their grandfather had received a letter from a real British soldier. As they examined the official letterhead with wide eyes, Richard thought about how differently they would see the world than he had at their age. Can we write back to him? Tyler asked excitedly. Richard considered this. I don't know if we can. He's a very busy man. But he wrote to you, Lily pointed out with impeccable 5-year-old logic. How about this? Richard suggested. Why don't you both draw pictures of what you think the guards at Buckingham Palace look like? And I'll see if there's a way to send them. The children raced inside to get paper and crayons, leaving Richard alone on the porch for a moment. He took out his phone and reread Thompson's letter, still moved by the connection that had formed between two men from different worlds, different generations, different backgrounds, all because of one ugly moment that could have deepened divisions but somehow had done the opposite. When Carol returned to pick up the children that evening, she found them proudly showing their grandfather their artwork. Tyler had drawn a line of guards in red uniforms of various skin tones, while Lily had created a colorful palace with what appeared to be a unicorn standing guard alongside the soldiers. What's all this? Carol asked, smiling at their enthusiasm. We're sending pictures to Grandpa's friend in England, Lily announced. He's a captain who fights bad guys. Carol raised an eyebrow at her father, who shook his head slightly. I'll explain later, he said quietly. After the children had packed up their drawings and said their goodbyes, Carol lingered for a moment. Dad, you seem different since that London trip, she said thoughtfully. More, engaged with the world? Richard considered this. Maybe I am. Seeing what I saw there, it made me think about things differently. Made me want to do better, I guess. Well, whatever it is, it suits you, she said, giving him a hug. The kids adore these visits even more now. They say you tell better stories. After she left, Richard sat alone on his porch as evening settled over Millfield. From this spot, he could see the steeple of First Methodist, the water tower with the town's name, the baseball field where he'd coached Carol's Little League team decades ago. It was the same view he'd looked at for 30 years, yet somehow it all looked different now. He thought about Captain Thompson, standing tall in his uniform thousands of miles away, probably unaware of how much their brief, indirect connection had affected an old man in a small American town. He thought about his grandchildren, growing up with different lessons than he had received. And he thought about himself, still learning, still changing, still finding new ways to understand the world, even after all these years. The tourists who had passed through town today would see Millfield as just another small town, unchanging and isolated. But they couldn't see beneath the surface where even the oldest trees were still growing, their roots reaching into new soil, their branches stretching toward the light.